Okay, so the truth is coming out. Now, I want to take you back to the moment where Kamala Harris's former campaign staffers, they had that interview with Pod Save America, and they did explain why Kamala did not have the interview at Joe Rogan. Let's look at that first, because now there is another story that is being released that apparently is a lot different than what they said on Pod Save America. Were they trying to run cover? Let's see. Let's get into this clip here. Just a reminder, what happened with the Rogan situation.
One of the, I'm believed to be the more tedious post-election debates is about, should Kamala Harris have gone on Rogan? Can you just, not to be tedious about it, could you talk a little bit about how close she came to doing it, why it didn't happen?
Yeah, there's a lot of intrigue around this, a lot of theories. It's pretty simple. We wanted to do it. I hate to repeat this over and over, but it was a very short race with a limited number of days. And for a candidate to leave the battleground to go to Houston, which is a day off the playing field in the battleground, getting that timing right is really important. So we had discussions with Joe Rogan's team. They were great. They wanted us to come on. We wanted to come on. We tried to get a date to make it work, and ultimately we just weren't able to find a date. We did go to Houston, and she gave a great speech at an amazing event.
The Beyonce event?
Yes, well, I'm going to call it reproductive freedom, and because Texas is ground zero for the impact of these Trump abortion bans. There's a story out today, in fact, of another young woman who lost her life because of it. And we were hoping to be able to fit it in around that, and ultimately weren't able to do it. As it turns out, that was the day that Trump was taping his Joe Rogan, which they had never.
Okay. Hold on to what she said, okay? Don't forget about that.
Never confirmed to us. We kind of figured that out in the lead up to it. She was ready, willing to go on Joe Rogan. Would it have changed anything? It would have been it would have broken through, not because of the conversation with Joe Rogan, but because the fact that she was doing it. And that was really the benefit of it. Will she do it sometime in the future? Maybe. Who knows? But it, didn't ultimately impact the outcome one way or the other. But she was willing to do whatever it takes.
Okay. Because the story that is being released now is a little bit different, right? Okay. And it almost felt like they were trying to protect not just Kamala, but when you hear this other part of the story, it also kind of seemed like they were trying to protect Joe Rogan a little bit too. And I want to show you why. Now it is being reported that that story has changed. So let's go on here. Make this smaller. I think there's okay, there we go. Okay. So that was the story that was given by her former campaign staff, right? But a new story has been published. You guys got to see this, that says something a little bit different. And I want you to tell me who you think is to blame. It says how Harris failed to land Rogan. So let's go down here and we'll make sure that that video doesn't get in the way, because sometimes that does. Okay. And we'll make it a little bit bigger. All right. So the obvious answer, Joe Rogan, a late 1990s sitcom star turned bro with a brain podcaster. So Rogan boasted a subscriber base that amounted to a total eclipse of the genre's universe, with nearly 15 million signed up just on Spotify alone. So they're talking about here how this could have been the way to really give Kamala's campaign, or at least Kamala Harris, more attention in a space where maybe she has not ventured to before, right? With a different audience. It goes on to say here The vast majority of Rogan's guests and listeners were white men, presenting Harris with a potential opportunity to prove her mettle by walking into the lion's den. So let's walk through the timeline, because the video I just played for you doesn't go through all of this. On October 11th, Harris Deputy Campaign Manager Rob Flaherty, the aide in charge of digital strategy, made the first Zoom call to start negotiating with Rogan's representatives. So let's highlight this here. I'll still make it bigger too, because I know how the text can be, guys. He did not know what to expect. This might be juiced up, UFC looking supplement people, he thought. He was surprised, perhaps a tad disappointed, to find out that Rogan's associates were more like Hollywood agents. In that vein, they outlined the podcaster's conditions for an interview. No staff in the studio, no topic restrictions, and Harris would have to sign a waiver. So now we're getting a little bit more information about this. And I could see how this could make someone a little bit hesitant if there are certain things that they didn't feel comfortable talking about. I'm not sure if this was the same conditions that were given to Donald Trump for Joe Rogan's interview. I don't know. But you can see where there could have been some issues here, in particularly no topic restrictions, right? So a lot of times with political candidates, there is like a topic restriction, or there are certain things that they'll say you're not allowed to ask these questions, or we need all the questions prior to the interview. That's not uncommon. And it said here that the waiver has to be signed, right? So people have to remember, those of us older millennials out here, we remember Joe Rogan when he was on Fear Factor. Like, I remember he was telling people to eat bugs, right? So before he had the Joe Rogan podcast, before like all the popular UFC, like, you know, commentary and fights from him. So it makes sense to me that his team would be more of like a Hollywood type. Remember, he was a comedian. He's on Fear Factor, all that kind of stuff. So let's continue on. There was more than one item in the small print. Harris would have to come to Austin, Texas. Rogan's rep said that might be negotiable, but he had only once done an interview with an out-of-studio guest, and that was, of course, Edward Snowden. I think a lot of people saw that interview with him, right? Obviously, Edward Snowden couldn't come here. Along with fellow Harris campaign advisors Stephanie Cutter and Brian Fallon, Flaherty offered up that Harris would be happy to talk about social media censorship, weed, and other issues they thought would be of most interest to his listeners. So this is another thing, this part right here. Now it seems like you're trying to discuss issues. You're trying to discuss those issues because that's what you feel his audience cares about. Now it kind of seems like you don't want her to be herself. You know what I mean? Because they wouldn't send that to Al Sharpton, or they wouldn't have sent that to probably Call Her Daddy, like if she sat down with the Call Her Daddy podcast, right? So now it kind of feels like you're trying to make her be something else. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know. So it goes on to say, I'm with you, Casey. It was rough for me too. Casey said Fear Factor used to make me vomit. Fear Factor was rough. I don't know why people eat bugs all the time. God damn it. Anywho, from their perspective, it was a suggestion of possible topics, not an exhaustive or exclusive list. That's not what Rogan wanted to talk about. So listen to this. Joe just wants to talk about the economy, the border, and abortion. One of his reps said, according to a person familiar with negotiations. So that's interesting. Like, he didn't even want to get into those topics. After 2 Zoom sessions, Flaherty called the Rogan intermediaries with an offer. Could Rogan join Harris in Michigan? Okay. Says proposing a date later in the week. No go. The Rogan team said after reaching the host on a week-long hunting trip, Austin or nothing. So can I just say this part? This is where I think probably wasn't the best idea to suggest having him travel out, because I think everybody knows that the guest goes to Austin, Texas. Like, we've watched a number of Joe Rogan interviews where it's not just Joe Rogan sitting there by himself. Like, obviously the guest comes to him. So why would there be an exception? Like, Trump came there. So if Trump came there, why would there be an exception so just think about this for a second. That's not the style of the show. Maybe someone else would have been willing to do that, but that's just not the way it works, right? So it goes on to say that's going to be tough. This is coming from Flaherty again. We're only a few weeks out from the election. Harris had less than zero reason to be in Texas. It was not a swing state. Her campaign was flush with cash, so it made no sense to take her off the trail to raise money. She was in a battleground or bust mode. Plus, a detour to Texas might smell like desperation to the press and a waste of money dollars. Okay, but then they went on to do the Beyonce event in Texas. So I get, you were coming to Texas anyway. Like, that's the thing. That's what was weird to me. It goes on to say here, okay, O'Malley Dillon said the campaign could fly her to Houston for a rally under the cover of visiting a state with one of the most restrictive abortion laws, to put her in proximity to Austin. She dispatched an advance team to the Texas state capitol to do a walkthrough of Rogan's studio and get ready for a Harris arrival. So this is the part I did not know. Let's highlight this right here. She dispatched an advance team to the Texas state capitol to do a walkthrough of Rogan's studio and get ready for a Harris arrival. She authorized her negotiating team to give Rogan what he demanded, an in-person studio interview in Austin on October 25th. So that part was not mentioned in the Pod Save America conversation. And I guess the question I ask is, why didn't they mention all of this? Why did they leave that part out? I mean, it almost feels like, and wait till we get to the other part, because it almost feels like they're not just trying to protect her, they were trying to protect him too. And I'll show you what I mean in just a second. It goes on to say, Rogan called Trump a man baby. We know about that part. This part right here. At the same time, Rogan was hardly Mr. Popular, instead inside Harris camp. Her brother-in-law, Tony West, longtime advisor, Minion Moore, and others argued against putting Harris on the podcast, especially after her first venture into politically tough terrain. They're talking about with Fox's Brett Bart. Now, this part right here, there was no telling what Rogan might ask her or how he would treat her. Plus, his anti-work crusade had made him a pariah on the hard left. They were overruled by O'Malley Dillon's crew, but not because the concerns were considered invalid. Even for those of us who were in favor of it, it was a close call, said one of the Harris advisors involved in the back and forth. Now, here's the part of the back and forth to me that was, I think, pretty important that people should have known about. On October 10th, the day before Flaherty spoke to Rogan, the Harris campaign, their weekly internal analytics assessment of the race, had projected Harris winning exactly 270 electoral votes. She was on track to take the blue wall and Nebraska's 2nd district, but lose the rest of the swing states, at least according to her own analysts. Well, we know how that went, huh? We know how that didn't work out. Then they go on to talk about how beneath the top line numbers, though, the analytics showed why it was important for Harris to reach the type of voters who listen to Rogan. In battleground states, Trump led Harris by 10.6 percentage points among men and trailed her by 9.3 percentage points among women. So again, it sounds like they still felt like she should go onto the show. Now, this is the part that's wild. For many Democratic operatives outside the campaign, the October 22nd announcement that Harris would hold a Houston rally felt like a palm to face moment. She was going to lose Texas by a lot, and a visit would not force Trump to spend his limited campaign money there. Her aides scheduled the rally for a Friday night in the fall, which was October 25th. So hold on to that date. In Texas, it was as if no one on her team knew that the night reserved for high school football was more sacred than Easter in the state. Campaign advisor David Plouffe responded to the criticism publicly, explaining that Harris wanted to shine a light on a place where she believed Trump anti-abortion policies had done the most damage to women's health. Okay, fast forward back to the Rogan stuff. Now it goes on to say only a few people knew the real reason. The whole Houston rally was built to put her in proximity to Rogan. The ongoing negotiations on that were touch and go. So do you guys see what this says here? The real reason. So it wasn't even, so put this way. They're admitting the real reason wasn't even about reproductive health. The real reason was to put her in close proximity to Joe Rogan so they could still try to work out a date for the podcast. Now here comes the weird part though. So Flaherty had called his Rogan contacts on October 18th before the rally was set. We could do Friday, the 25th. This is coming from Flaherty. Wish we would have known about this sooner because he has the 25th blocked out as a personal day. That's coming from one of Joe Rogan's reps. So October 25th, which they were preparing to do the Houston rally for, they said, while we're there, let's try to do that same date with Joe Rogan so we could just do, the boop, boop, Austin, then the rally, Austin, the rally, right? But Joe Rogan's staff said that he had a personal day on October 25th, so that wasn't going to work. But check this out. What about Saturday morning? Flaherty countered. Only if it's before 8:30 a.m. came the tough reply. The tone is different, Flaherty thought. The vice president of the United States is offering to come to your effing show, and you keep putting up more hoops. Harris's team still wanted to make it work, but a new wariness set in. Nikki said, I can see why Kamala had a high turnover of staff. Yeah. So they were still trying to make it work. It goes on to say on October 22nd, the same day the Harris camp announced the rally, the Associated Press reported that Trump would be Rogan's guest on Friday, the personal day Rogan had originally reserved. Is it sinking with everybody? On October 22nd, the same day that Kamala Harris's camp announced the rally, the Houston rally, the Associated Press reported that Donald Trump would be Rogan's guest on Friday, October 25th, the personal day Rogan had originally reserved. So one or two things happen here, folks. This is an interesting part. One or two things happen here. Either Joe Rogan's representatives were not honest and just said he had a personal day that day to try to brush her off, or they were honest, and they were looking at his calendar and it did say it was a personal day, but he was willing to make an exception for Donald Trump. Because the staff knows if there's a guest, they book the guest. From what I understand, Joe Rogan doesn't book his own guest, right? A lot of people don't. So here's what I think happened, and I'm just shooting in the dark here. It seems like to me, maybe he did have October 25th on his calendar as a personal day. But it almost kind of sounds like maybe he was willing to make an exception for Donald Trump, even though that was a personal day for him. Maybe he made an exception. Like, for example, sometimes I'll tell people like, well, I can't, I don't stream on certain days, right? But if someone wants to come on and I'm not streaming that day, I'll just record it and then upload it. You guys have seen me do this before, right? So it sounds like to me that either they knew that he had Donald Trump booked already, and maybe he put it in the calendar as a personal day because he did not want that to get leaked or whatever. But regardless, the staff books the guest. So they would have known that Donald Trump was coming on anyway. And they probably didn't want to tell that to Kamala because they didn't want that to get out. Either way, it's interesting that all of this is coming out now after they had that interview with Pod Save America, because they didn't even say this in the Pod Save America interview. So why now? Something to think about, folks. Something to think about. But the truth has apparently come out. I don't know. Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.